Part 1. Real and Imagined Study. Sufis and their imitators. Question. What can you do about imitators? It has been observed that, since you started to make Sufism known really widely in the West, numerous small groups have been enlarged and entirely new ones have sprung up, and most people realize that these are just cults and not Sufi groups at all. The Small Boy and the Examination. Answer. That reminds me of a joke. It is said that a small boy was faced with an examination question. What is rabies and what can you do about it? He wrote as his answer, rabies is Jewish priests, and there is nothing you can do about it. These Sufis are Sufists, not Sufis, and there is nothing that you can do about it. I am, however, interested in an inherent assumption, the one behind the question, that one should either have anything to do about it, or that one could, indeed, do anything about it. If we try to do anything about it, we risk attracting large numbers of disenchanted former Sufists, who would hope at first that we could give them the real thing, but who would become doubly homeless, so to speak, when they found that one branch of the entertainment industry had closed down and another failed to open up. Sufi studies in the West and in the contemporary East, it should be remembered, are repeating a pattern. Not only do humorous tales contain valuable structures for understanding, their use also helps to weed out people who lack a sense of humor. Sufis hold that people who have not developed or who have suppressed their capacity to enjoy humor are, in this deprived state, also without learning capacity in the Sufi sphere. Throughout the ages there have been Sufis and imitators. Perhaps to clarify things in your own mind, you might like to ask yourself this question. Why do I imagine that there is any activity that does not have imitators, charlatans, confusion, and tourists and passengers? People do not find that they can do anything about tricksters or cranks who offer a trip to the moon, except to increase public information on spaceflight. I cannot help feeling that the questioner is defining his own mentality and showing us that he is thinking in a more confined way than his limitations require. If we can do anything about the imitation, it is to spread the information of the real. But our doing this depends upon the audience being prepared. The preparation involves a wideness of horizon and the intelligent use of the clear-thinking methods which are already current in all present-day societies, though only lately coming into use in our area of interest. The negative attitude is to look at the imitators. The positive one, surely, is to remember the words of Jalaluddin Rumi, who said that false gold only exists because there is such a thing as the real. Jami and the externals. Both imitators and the followers of previous formulations, whose externals alone persist, can be reminded, especially if they read the Sufi classics, that externals are not the same as content. It is in this vein that the great teacher Jami speaks in his Baharistan, the abode of spring. The rose is gone from the garden. What can I do with the thorns and leaves? The Shah is not in the city. What shall I do with his court? The attractions are the cage, beauty and goodness the parrot. When the parrot has flown, what can I do with the cage? Analogy of the fur jacket. In Fihi ma Fihi, we find the allegory of the jacket. In winter, says Rumi, you look for a fur garment, but when summer comes you have no time for it. It is an encumbrance. So it is with imitations of real teachings. They keep people warmed until the time comes when they can be warmed by the sun. So, like the fur garment, people will cleave to cults and imitations because these things suit them, respond to something within them which calls for cults and imitations. At the same time, of course, they imagine all sorts of things about themselves, such as that they are genuine, sincere, unconcerned about themselves and concerned about others or about truth. Shibli and the Stones. In a famous instance, recorded for instance in the Ilahi Nama of Hakim Sanai, the Sufi teacher Shibli of Khorasan made this self-deception a matter of illustration teaching in a dramatic event which he initiated. Because of his extravagant utterances, disliked by the authorities, Shibli was chained up as a madman. A number of people who respected him went to him on a visit, inquiring about his welfare. He asked them who they considered themselves to be, and they answered that they were his friends. At this, Shibli hurled stones at them, and they ran away. Shibli shouted, "You say that you are my friends, thinking of me, but I have shown you that you flee from my affliction, and hence you are concerned not for me, but for your own protection from stones." To receive what is not your destiny. Besides, we should bear in mind the teaching of the great sage Abul Hasan Kirkani, recorded in Attar's Recitals of the Saints. The people of the world have a fixed destiny, but the spiritually developed receive what is not in their destiny. Question: what is the harm in imitating? I am sure that most, if not all, of the human development systems which are publicly offered are only imitations. If, however, these give people pleasure and some taste of a deeper reality, they surely must have a value. The knots standing in the way of the textiles. If you take an analogy, you might see it differently. Supposing we were discussing the art of weaving which might be developed. Supposing people were at a stage where they could only tie knots in string, which gave them pleasure and might be regarded as a foretaste of weaving. If the people only imitated the knotting phase, and in addition regarded the knotting as the entire art, when would weaving itself come into being, no matter how much pleasure there was attached to it? Certainly, knotting would have a value as such, but it would also constitute a barrier to going further, if the idea of anything further were abolished, by people thinking that knots were as far as anyone could go in textile work. There are 2 points worth noting here. The first is that pleasure certainly is not to be opposed, but there are many sources of pleasure, and to seek pleasure as a part of something more specific leads to confusion and more. The second is that if you get obsessed by the early stages of something, imagining it to be the whole, you will not go further. The woman and the spiritual being. Look at the ancient tale of the woman and the spiritual being. There was once a poor woman who helped a spiritual being disguised as a wanderer from far away, giving him hospitality when others had cast him out. As he left her house, he said, "May your first task tomorrow last all day." She thought that this was a strange way of thanking someone, but soon forgot. The following day, a merchant brought her a short length of gold thread and asked her to embroider it onto a garment, for embroidery was her work when she could get any. She unwound the gold and embroidered the cloth. When she had finished, she saw that there was more gold thread on the floor than she had started out with. The more she wound it up into a ball, the more there was. She wound gold thread all day, and by nightfall she had an enormous quantity. By tradition, leftover thread belonged to the embroideress. She sold this thread, and with the money she was able to rebuild her house and furnish it, as well as set herself up with a fine shop. Naturally, the neighbors became curious, and she told them how her luck had changed and what had caused it. Some time later, a merchant in the same town saw and recognized the stranger with magical powers from what the woman had said about him, and invited him into his shop and home. He showed the spiritual being great hospitality, imitating the way in which open-handed people behave, even carrying his attentiveness to extremes. He thought, there must be something in this for me, and of course for everyone in this town. He added the second phrase to his thoughts because, although greedy, he imagined that just to think of others would get him something for himself. Because, however, he was imitating charity, and because he did not think of the good of others equally with his own good, but only as an afterthought, things turned out differently for him than for the charitable woman. When the stranger was about to leave, the merchant said, "Give me a blessing." "I do not do that," said the stranger, "but I wish that your first concern today should endure for a week." He went on his way, and the merchant set off for his counting house, where he proposed to count money, multiplying it for a whole week. On the way across his own courtyard, the merchant stopped for a drink of water at his well. No sooner had he pulled up one bucketful than he found himself compelled to draw another, and this went on for an entire week. The water flooded his house, then that of the neighbors, and finally the whole town, almost causing it to collapse.